So I want to read a little selection from the book just because it's too perfect that we're all here together on behalf of what I call the Stanwood Library, which I understand is part of the larger Sno-Isle library system, but I call the Stanwood Library. So I think you know the characters. Leopoldo is my stepfather, Claudia is my mother. We're living in this funky apartment. My mother actually is also found work. She's taking care of a wonderful, although at this point quite senile, old lady named Inga Bangs, who used to live here. I don't know if anyone knew Inga. So I would go over. You know Inga? I'll have to get the Inga report or the family report. What's that? You knew her. Yeah. So I used to go over there, and she would turn to my mother and say, "Tell the boy to put the horse out." And my mother would say, "Inga, you don't have a horse." And you know. And she would make me lutefisk, which was always awkward. She would sit there and want to watch me eat every last bit of it, which the whole vegetarian thing, she didn't accept that at all. And that was some painful stuff, but I got through it, which I think got my honorary Norwegian badge from that. So this is now, I'm in Mrs. King's classroom, and I have this new resource available to me, the library. That winter brought wild storms howling in off the Puget Sound, followed suddenly by calm and open skies. Like the alternating rhythms of rain and sun, I accepted the rounds of violence and reconciliation in my home as normal. Not ideal, not pleasant, but reliable and certain. The steady cadence of Leopoldo and Claudia marching together as husband and wife. Home was bearable in times of peace, but in times of war, I sought political asylum at the Stanwood Library. And there I began cruising the Dewey Decimal System for meaning and inspiration. But I didn't just leap into the beige metal stacks with my eyes closed. I had a destination in mind, the neighborhood of call number 296. Librarians in the house? Judaism, whatever that was. My research was the fulfillment of a prophecy made back on Cultus Mountain above Clear Lake before the advent of Leopoldo. Climbing the trail one evening, we passed the cabin of a neighbor named Ray and noticed it glowing through the darkening mist. Ray very rarely ventured up from Seattle, so we stopped in to say hello. He looked like a fisherman from the back of a National Geographic map of Crete, and he exhibited an appropriately Mediterranean hospitality. He welcomed us in with one of those thick, back east kind of accents that vaguely reminded me of my Grandma Harriet. He was originally from New York, he told us, and he wanted to know where we were from. The Bay Area, replied Claudia. No way, Ray said. I don't believe you. Why not? You're Jews, right? Ain't no landsman from San Francisco. Claudia laughed. Yeah, we are Jews. How did you know? Your kid, look at him, he's got a rabbi's nose. They laughed and spoke of ancient times, places and people east of the Mississippi, chicken soup and strange holidays. Ray's whole body shook when he laughed, and he concluded his story with, so I bet I was the only Italian kid in Brooklyn who had not one but 2 bar mitzvahs. Claudia and I stepped back into the mist, and a faint light of recognition flared in my mind. We weren't totally alone in this universe. There was a name for us, a name for why Grandma Harriet said, "Who really knew?" when I asked her where we were from. A name for being Russian, Lithuanian, and German, but cringing at the memory of those Russians, Lithuanians, and Germans. The name explained why my grandfather was blacklisted by McCarthy and forced to drag his family from place to place. And the same name must be the reason we continued to wander, searching for a promised land while we read books and gesticulated wildly with our hands. A name that explained it all, but I'd forgotten what it was. Claudia, what was that thing he said we were? What thing? There was something he knew we were, like because of my nose. Oh, Jews. Yeah, what is that? I never told you we were Jewish? No. What is it? You know, Einstein, Freud, Marx. Being my mother's son, I knew who these men were, but I didn't see the connection. Like, we're related to them? Sort of. And then she gave a very Jewish answer. You know, Joshy, I don't know exactly what it means to be Jewish. We'll have to go to the library and look it up. So I was in the library now, this library right here, riding the reading room through space and time, discovering that I was part of something profound. I was apparently the descendant of an ancient tribe that had emerged from the mists of prehistory to introduce the world to God, to write the Bible, and to shine unto the nations like a beacon of righteousness. We had been scattered to the wind, driven to the four corners of the earth, oppressed and demeaned time and time again, and yet we wandered on, excelling in isolation wherever we went. We didn't need to be normal like everybody else. We were Jews. When the library closed, I walked through the darkness, an only child no more. Now I knew we descended from the seed of Jacob, and somewhere out there were maybe 1 million of my nameless brethren, clinging to diasporic rocks just like me, but thriving nonetheless. I was flipping through the pages. I whispered to my mother in the rank, lutefiski darkness of Inga's sitting room. And there was a drawing of Maimonides. He looked just like me, but with a beard and a turban, the same face, the same rabbi's nose. He spoke to you across the generations, Claudia assured me. Yeah, he did. I agreed with her for once. My mother whispered to me then about our family. My great-great-grandmother Rivka, who was a folk healer in the forests of Russia. My great-grandmother Etta, who called the mounted police Cossacks and threw her body in front of the Nazi ships unloading in Boston Harbor in 1939. And then Claudia told me that somewhere out there I might have a half-brother. When she was a teenager, she dated, briefly, a Colombian Marxist revolutionary and had gotten pregnant. She'd given the baby up for adoption in New Jersey and had never seen him again. It was 1987 now, so that would make him 23. My mother shook her head and shrugged. It was all part of an old world she'd forgotten about so long ago. But it was a brand new world for me. I lay in bed that night still immersed in my voyage of self-discovery, and though I sojourned at the very end of the earth, I felt the blood of Abraham course through my veins. And beyond the horizon, in the wilds of far-off New Jersey, that same blood might course through the veins of a brother as well. And maybe someday this brother would find me, grasp me by the arm, and pull me up out of this broken world where screaming and smashing were considered normal. And maybe I'd finally go home, wherever that was. So, thank you. So you have to understand, I'd been out hitchhiking and been living in strange places. We'd never been walking distance to a library before. Every now and again we'd pop in, but we usually never got a library card because we were always moving on, and my mother, to her credit, didn't want to steal the books, in which case I would have probably had thousands and thousands of dollars of fines. So I suddenly have this library, and remember this is in the pre-internet era, which shouldn't matter, but for me, it was like the World Wide Web. It was each book was a window into some new area that I'd never heard of. And I began to feel very much like, as I said earlier, Christopher Columbus discovering the new world, America, much to the surprise of all the Americans who are already living in it. And that library was my portal, was my aperture to have that learning. And I became, which for many years I considered myself a library Jew. So my Jewish identity was all learned here at the Stanwood Library. And I read my way through Jewish history, I read my way through Jewish ethics, through the biblical texts. And as I began to sit in that library hour after hour, I began to realize that Jewish history in many ways paralleled my own life. Sort of this wandering from place to place and yet trying to succeed, trying to do well. And the other aspect of the library, in addition to being this sort of intellectual haven for me and having these wonderful librarians, one of the librarians, and I am so remorseful that I don't remember their names after this time, but one of the librarians, I remember, she was the first person that taught me that sometimes you needed a strategy. If you're going to seriously read a book, you got to sit down and make a plan how you're going to read it. And I remember in 7th grade, I don't know if you remember this, I set out to read War and Peace, right? Remember that? Which, in full disclosure, I never completely finished, but she sat down with me, and I told her this, and she was like, this is a big deal for you. And I was like, yeah, this is a big book. And she was like, okay. And so a couple days later, after I checked the book out, she came back, and she was like, here are these 3x5 cards I've prepared. To get through this book, you got it. These are the characters, and you're going to have to kind of keep track of these different arcs. And she taught me how to read critically, and how to think through a book, and really to how to place my point of view in that of the writer, of the author, which is something that I've embraced, obviously. So this was this amazing woman, and that's half of the way in which the library was amazing. And the other half, which is the side of people who use libraries, which I don't, like my girls are sometimes like, the smelly homeless guy is in the section again, and you're like, oh well, I was kind of the smelly homeless guy. I don't know how smelly I was, but I was this kid who literally used the library not just as a literary refuge or as an intellectual refuge, but as a physical refuge. My home was pretty, garbage strewn to begin with, but on top of it, it was a war zone. And this was a place of peace and of refuge for me. And literally the ability to use that nice bathroom, or to just sit there and read, or to be there after school until the end of the day, was an amazing public service to me. So it was a solid year and a half that I was in the Stanwood Library, every second that I basically wasn't in school. And I had an amazing intellectual experience and journey that began there. And then later, when we had moved out of county, when we finally found our commune up in Skagit County, I continued to come back to Stanwood for school through 11th grade, and then 12th grade I went to Skagit Valley College, and my wonderful and inspiring drama guru is here, Andy Friedlander, who had me in his production of Hamlet. Thank you. Dave is here. Dave Pinkham, right? Right. So thank you, David, for giving my mother a vocation there. And I don't know if, is John Dean here? I don't know if John... So anyway, she worked with John Dean, and they both worked for David Pinkham, and she was working for the news. And Elio, will you get me like a paper towel for my forehead? Or a bottle of water. So it's a little... See? People of Stanwood continue to give. So this was my experience, and so at that time, as my mother was then working, I had to stay after school when my mother was working, and so I went back and was still at this library and doing the next level of research, and that's the point where I discovered the Sno-Isle connection, which was that they didn't have the book in the building. Wherever it was on Earth, they would track it down, and it would arrive for you like a present that would just show up. And they'd be like, here's your book. And I was the guy with like the 30 books. So here's your book. It was great. So thank you very much to Stanwood Libraries for that refuge. So let's take a step back. We're still here with my stepfather, Leopoldo. And I want to give an important final shout out and then a takeaway, and then let's do the Q&A. For some reason, with my mother, it was okay that my stepfather was beating her. Part of it was, this was a way that he expressed love, right? His jealousy was kind of flattering in some weird way. She felt, as an American, she was somehow culpable for America's foreign policy that had victimized him. She, quite frankly, felt trapped and felt that she couldn't get out. But when the violence turned to me, luckily for me, that crossed the line for my mother, and that was it. We had to get out. And when the time came to get out, again, we didn't know where we could go. He knew everyone that we knew. There wasn't any place that my mother was allowed to go that he wasn't aware of. And my mother thought of the one person who was sort of in the Jewish tradition, there's this idea that there are 36 saints whose humble, secret good deeds hold up the entire world. So at the time, at least, one of the 36 saints was this woman, Tammy Kirby, who my mother and I were both very close with, and my mother was very involved in anti-nuclear proliferation work. With Tammy, we were part of I think it was like the Stanwood Commando Friends for Peace or something. And where did we meet? Appropriately enough, at the library were our meetings. So my mother knew, Leopoldo doesn't know Tammy, doesn't know about her. I'll call Tammy and see what she can recommend. And so we called Tammy, and Tammy said, I know this Quaker couple, John and Susan Oliver, and John is here tonight. So you'll have to clap for him again in a minute when you hear what he did. So in my memory of it, John may differ, but in my memory of it, she basically is cold calls these people, says, "Hey, we heard you guys have like a Quaker Underground Railroad going. We're in need of some, railroading. We're in need of some transitional housing to get out of a sketchy domestic violence situation." And John and Susan were like, "We don't know you, but we would love for you to come and shelter in our basement apartment as long as you need us to be there." As long as they took us in, we like literally left one afternoon, showed up at their apartment, and there we stayed. And we, I guess, probably would have stayed there forever. But then serendipitously, my mother met a woman in the Skagit Valley Food Cooperative, where else, who happened to be walking through the aisle of like bulk brewer's yeast and broccoli or whatever it was, who said, "We just need one more family for this land trust that we have out in Skagit Valley, and we're making this beautiful utopia." And my mother was like, "Thank you, goddess." And she went and introduced herself, and this wonderful community called Walker Creek took us in. And for the first time in my life, I had a positive male role model who's here tonight. Aviathar Pemberton is here. And one of the first conversations that we had was my mother was literally like, "Thank you for letting us in and for having us here, and we're going to build a house here. And now that we're here, BTW, by the way, there may be like an insane, violent alcoholic, war criminal coming to look for us. So should you see anyone matching this description?" And I was kind of like waiting, like, "Oh boy, how's this going to..." And Aviathar was like, "That's all right, I'll take care of it. I'll be on the lookout. No, don't worry, I'll handle it." And we're like, "Good." And we were confident that he could. And so luckily, that showdown never happened. And from there, I was at Walker Creek for 5 years, once again without running water, electricity, or much of anything, but continued to go to Stanwood schools. And the last shout out, as I was doing my weird Columbus discovering America thing, kind of trying to fit in, trying to understand what this whole sports was about and what that meant and why people kept talking about it all the time, and football and whatever else. I guess I'll switch analogies. Now I'm John Smith, if you know American colonial history, which I learned at the library. Dorothy Galbraith is here as my Pocahontas, I guess. So is my was one of the few people, and I think Don Setti's here. Is Don here? I don't know. Anyway, a couple of other friends of mine from that time sort of saw me as this strange, outlandish guy, and were, I guess, entertained or just like, that guy seems weird but cool. But really took me in, and Dorothy's whole family, in fact, took me in, and her father, John Galbraith, was my 8th grade teacher. And by 8th grade, we were away from my stepfather, and I was really, all right, I forgot, I have to thank your dad. Yeah, so in 8th grade, I was really kind of acting up. My grades were slumping. I had toughened myself and kind of shaved like part of my head, and was wearing a lot of black clothing with like skeletons on it. And I was kind of looking for an authority figure to tangle with, and her dad was my 8th grade homeroom teacher there, and he had us doing the journals for like Washington State history, the Oregon Trail, right? So I'm begin writing. I think I wrote the assignment. I think was like, I don't know, like 10 pages or something. So I wrote like 100-page magnum opus, like real journal that involved just like graphic violence and just beheadings and crazy things. And a lot of swearing, just to push the limits with her father, John Galbraith, just to try, get a reaction out of him. And one time he called me in, and I was like, "All right, here it is. He's gonna, and he had one comment for me. He was like, "You're a really good writer. You should keep writing, like really good quality stuff." So I did, John Galbraith. Thank you. So I guess so. The takeaway. What's the takeaway? First of all, libraries are awesome. Continue to support your local library and your local bookseller, but mostly your local library, who really, you don't understand how much of a public service these guys perform. And also the little things. I found, to be honest with you, I'm sure none of you were in the room, but I found like kind of the majority of Stanwoodians were sort of like, "Who are these weird, freaky people?" But there were a lot of people who did the little things or the big things like Mrs. King, but just the kind of giving me a smile, greeting me, being nice to me even though I was the weird guy, whatever, casting me in their play, whatever it was. These little things that really kind of affirmed the beauty of humanity, and that like I belonged and I deserved to be here, and inspired me to not only survive but to thrive. So I want to give you the blessing to go out and remember those people who may be in need. And thank you all.
When I first heard about the article in the Huffington Post regarding Josh's book, Free Spirit, several of my coworkers at the Stanwood Library asked me if I was aware of Joshua. The surname was not something that I was familiar with, but as soon as I opened his book and was flipping through and saw pictures of him as a child, I immediately knew who he was. His name was Joshua Reed when he lived in Stanwood and came to the Stanwood Library. I remember him the very first time I saw him as a young child, probably of about 10 years of age, and he had this beautiful curly hair, and I just thought, oh, what a great head of hair. And I just always enjoyed working with Josh at the library because he was such a wonderfully pleasant, well-mannered young man to work with. And I just have really fond memories of working with Josh at the Stanwood Library. I never did any reference work with him. I just simply would be at the circulation desk checking items out to him, and he was always pleasant.
Thank you, Elmira. Thank you. And can you tell us the names of your colleagues? There were like 3 of you that I remember, and you're one. Your hair is not as black, but yes, I remember you.
Hi.
How you doing? Let me give you a hug. Yeah, thank you. This is awesome. I'm gonna. All right. Thank you. And
I know. Oh, this is it. Okay, I'm here too. Nice to meet you. And Joseph.